Finish. You can't lay on egg.
Yeah,
You treat say, right the same. I did a treat.
and check and say.
Peanut butter for the same. A bet. Now we're just watching.
So, ladies and gentlemen, from today going, when you come to the academy for a function in the auditorium, we are referring this auditorium as the KWAME NKRUMAH Auditorium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof.
So we can now go back to start the KWAME NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture.
Tobo. You must be Jai. Come.
I'll kindly ask of you to kindly please take your seats as we start the second part of the program. Okay. Shall we please stand as we welcome the speaker and the chair for the second part, please? And please, as they walk in, kindly put your phones on silent. Thank you.
Everyone. President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, vice presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, Your Excellencies, Nananom, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, honorees present. On behalf of fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Ghana's Premier Learned Society, I warmly welcome you all to day 4 of a 4-day series of lectures marking this year's anniversary celebrations of the Academy. The Academy's anniversary celebrations, which are held in November, take the form of a presidential address delivered by the President of the Academy, a series of symposia involving fellows and non-fellows, and the KWAME NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture, which is the climax of the 4-day lecture series. On Tuesday, we had the presidential address. On Wednesday and yesterday, we had the 2-day symposium. And tonight, we will have the KWAME NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture. In 2003, a foundation member of the Academy, Professor Alexander Kwapong, who was then chairman of the Council of State, delivered the maiden KWAME NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture on the Academy's foundations and its role in national development. Another foundation member, Emeritus Professor J.H. Kwabena gave the 2004 KWAME NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture on KWAME NKRUMAH and the Arts. Since then, we have had the lecture every year, as you will see in your brochures. This year, 2022, we are privileged to have the opportunity to continue with the tradition on a topic that must concern us all. Today's NKRUMAH Memorial Lecture will be delivered by a personality who is a force to reckon with when it comes to the subject matter to be discussed. And he will be introduced by the chairman in a moment. Tonight, we are streaming live on all our social media networks, Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the chairman for tonight's event. He is Emeritus Professor Samuel Sefadede, President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a fellow of the International Academy of Food Science and Technology, as well as the Kellogg Foundation Leadership Program in Food Systems. Emeritus Professor Sefadede was chairman of the Planning Committee for the establishment of 2 public universities, University of Energy and Natural Resources, Sunyani, and University of Health and Allied Sciences, WHO. Emeritus Professor Sefadede was the team lead consultant for the development and preparation of Ghana's second Millennium Challenge Compact. He was also the board chair for the Millennium Development Authority for Ghana's Millennium Challenge Compact 1, and reappointed chair for the Millennium Development Authority for Ghana's Millennium Challenge Compact 2 until 7th January 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our chair for this evening.
Thank you, Honorary Secretary, for the introduction. Good evening, past presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, Nananum, ladies and gentlemen, and our esteemed students who have come in their numbers. You are welcome to this evening's lecture to be delivered by Emeritus Professor Ivan Idai-Mensah, former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana. He was also a former Vice President of the Sciences Section of the Academy. Emeritus Professor Idai-Mensah, a fellow, former Vice President of the Sciences Section of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, is a Professor Emeritus of Chemistry and former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana. For over 5 decades, he has taught and done research in universities in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Germany, where he was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation from 1982 to 1984 and 1995. He is a life fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, UK, fellow, Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, is a chartered chemist, and fellow, Ghana Chemical Society. He has published a considerable number of books and research papers. He has been a member of the board of the United Nations University Institute of Natural Resources in Africa since 2001. Since 1988, He has been a member of the WHO Expert Committee on Drug Quality Assurance. He has also conducted consultancy assignments for several other national and international organizations. Professor Emeritus Adai Mensah has received honorary Doctor of Human Studies letters from New York University, 2002, honorary Doctor of Science from University of Ghana, 2003, and the higher honor of Soga University, Tokyo, 1998. In 2006, the state of Ghana awarded him the Companion of the Order of Volta, COV. He has been a strong advocate for the underprivileged and gender equity in education, as well as education and social mobility. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our speaker for this evening to speak to us on the topic, Education Reforms in Ghana and their impact on the youth. Emeritus Professor, your audience.
All protocols observed. No, I have to acknowledge the chiefs first. Otherwise, I'll be called to the Sanhedrin, especially since one of them is the one I served as vice president. Let me start with a few remarks. First of all, I still give lectures in Legon, and I have a standing permission that if the lecture is more than 30 minutes, I can deliver the lecture sitting down. Definitely, today's lecture is going to be more than 30 minutes, but I will try and start by standing up. I just want to ask permission from you that as and when I feel tired, you will allow me to move to the second mode by going to sit down. Comment number 2. My former registrar at the University of Ghana, Ibu Daniel, used to say that there is nothing like a long lecture. There are only bad lectures. If a lecture is long, if a lecture is good, it can be 3 hours and you wouldn't know how it will end. But if a lecture is bad, within 15 minutes, you will be sleeping. I hope that those of you who will sleep during my lecture can just wake up just a few minutes before I finish the lecture so that you can clap. 22 years ago, in the year 2000, I gave the J.B. Dankwa Memorial Lectures, and that took 3 days. During that lecture, my mate, Hilda Dankwa, was present. I've seen her today coming to commemorate the father's honor. I met Hilda when we both went for interview at Cape Coast. She was the only girl among a large number of people who had come to be interviewed for Achimota School. And when she came, She was also the only one in shoes. The rest of us were all barefooted. Suddenly, Hilda vanished. We thought she had taken fright and run away, seeing only men around or boys around. But she suddenly appeared without the shoes. She had realized that maybe if the interviewers saw that she was the only one wearing shoes, they might disqualify her. But they didn't. We all ended up in Achimota. Hilda, if you are still around, I acknowledge you. I haven't seen you since your 70th birthday, when you specifically invited me to come and tell that story. Today I'm telling it again, since I haven't seen you for about 10 years. My lecture, as has been announced, is Educational Reforms in Ghana and Their Impact on the Youth. My lecture outline will take the form of an introduction, education in Ghana, a historical perspective, which will cover traditional education, various education reforms in Ghana, formal education in Ghana, starting with the traders and merchants, then the missionaries, then education under the colonial government, the Education Ordinance of 1852 and 1882, the Gettysburg era, the 1937 Education Committee reforms, the KWAME NKRUMAH era, pre- and post-independence educational policies, 1951 to 1966, and then I will summarize the post-NKRUMAH era, deal with the present situation, and then I will conclude. A nation's most treasured asset is its human resource. This is developed through the provision of quality education. Quality education raises the quality of life. Education is a lifelong enterprise, but it is the population between the ages of 3 and 28 that is usually the target of national politics. In every society, education is a major vehicle for social mobility, as well as social stratification, depending on the sort of impact it makes on the beneficiaries and the society as a whole. Whether the impact is positive or negative depends on the type of policies in place. Educational achievement is normally attributable to 3 major factors, namely opportunity, ability, and aspiration. Any reforms in a country's educational policies that do not take these factors into consideration are likely to adversely affect society, especially the youth. In 1933, a certain Joseph Ejima Mensah, a teacher at the Kumasi Methodist School, wrote a little book entitled National Problems. The foreword to that little book was by one Mr. Charles Ebenezer Donko, who was then a teacher at the Methodist Central School at Sokore, where our illustrious former president, Nana Krobi Asante, attended school, as well as Professor Edu Buahin. He was also in that school. The book was published by Arthur H. Stockwell Limited of 29 Ludgate Hill, London EC4. Chapters in that little book include the following: the training of children, the give and take policy of education, the village school, an allegory on the achievement of decentralization, and nationalism as an ideal for the youth. The issues that these two friends, Teacher Donko and Teacher Mensah, who were dormitory mates at Wesley College, used to discuss, which eventually culminated in the publication of that book, are still the same as the issues we are grappling with 89 years later. Now, who was Teacher Donko? Teacher Donko was the same person who, in 1954, nearly defeated Dr. K.A. Buzia in the general elections in the Wenchi constituency. He lost the election by just 11 votes. Now, who was Teacher Mensah? Teacher Mensah was my father. The book reminds me of the epigram the French writer Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Carr wrote in the journal Les Guêpes, or the Wasps, in 1849. And if I may borrow a leaf from His Excellency, the President Akufo-Addo, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. I'm giving the French edition first. Then I'll translate into English. The more things change, the more they remain the same. And now I'll translate into Fante. Manyama san na manyama ta note. We are still talking about the same things that these two sons of Ghana, or the Gold Coast at that time, talked about in 1933, 89 years ago. 87 years ago, in 1935, the Colonial Office reported that the then Gold Coast, now Ghana, a country with a population of about 3 million, had about 65,000 children in school, while Nigeria, with a population of over 15 million, had only 40,000 children in school. The situation in all other African countries then under colonial rule was even worse. Ghana has therefore been a pace setter in education in Africa. So what path has Ghana charted to get to where she is today? All past governments have sought to improve education through various reforms. In this lecture, I will look at the development of education in Ghana from a historical perspective. I will look at the traditional through the missionary, the colonial, and then, since this is the KWAME Nkrumah Memorial Lecture, I will give greater attention to the period from 1951 to 66, when Nkrumah was head of government and head of state. I will start with traditional education. Education is deeply rooted in our traditional societies. Traditional education provides a holistic approach to the development of the individual. The content includes history, geography, music, philosophy, religion, sociology, medicine for specially selected people, science, art and craft, and life skills. Character building, sociability, courage, endurance, ethics, and honor form the objectives of traditional education. In general, traditional education aims at making the individual a part of the society. Now, if the child is born into a royal household, other aspects of education are included in their upbringing. Most of what the child learns is informal, and the community constitutes the environment for their education. The education is not regimented or regulated by time and space, and every adult in the community is the teacher of every child. In the pre-colonial era, this type of education was more than adequate for meeting the economic, political, social, and cultural objectives of traditional societies. It trained and supplied enough farmers and artisans to produce quality goods and services. It provided personnel to perform political, military, and social roles, and also contributed to the cultural life of the people through the development of the literature, works of art, and music. However, with colonization, the strong and rich traditions of Ghanaian civilization began to be gradually replaced or be mixed up with external influences and cultures, including what is normally referred to as formal or Western education. Now, what have been the education reforms in Ghana? Over the years, educational reforms have sought to make education more accessible and qualitative. These reforms and policies include the following: the Education Ordinance of 1852, Education Ordinance of 1882, Education Ordinance of 1887, the Gettysburg Education Reform Program of 1925, the Education Reform of 1937, the Accelerated Development Plan for Education of 1951, the Education Act of 1961, Act 67, the 7-Year Development Plan 1963 to 64, 1969-70, the KWAME NKRUMAH 7-Year Development Plan, the KWAPON Report of 1967, the Jobo Report of 1973, which was the forerunner of the JHS-SSS system, the New Content and Structure of Education 1974, the Ghana Education Service Decree 1974, PNDC Law 42, 1983, PNDC Law 207, 1988, University Rationalization Committee Report 1988, the 1951, 57, 60, 79, and 92 Constitutions of Ghana, the Ghana Education Service Act of 1995, the Ghana Vision 2020 document, and now the Free SHS policy of 2017. In addition to these, there have been minor reforms normally aimed at fine-tuning various aspects of the education system within a broad policy framework. All post-independence constitutions and laws have enshrined the right of every child to basic education as a fundamental human right. Modern Western or formal education in Ghana started with the arrival of the Portuguese and other Europeans from the late 15th and early 16th century. Their main objective was economic exploitation. Lack of effective communication in the language of the visitor prompted the European trader to try and introduce the indigenous population to the foreign languages so that they could communicate and bargain trade conditions effectively. The Portuguese opened the first school in the Elmina Castle in 1529. They were followed by the Dutch, who also established a school in Elmina Castle in 1644, which lasted for 200 years. The English founded a school in Cape Coast in 1694, while the Danes opened one in Christianborg Castle in 1722. The traders were gradually replaced by the missionaries, who moved into the interior and took interest in the local people. Their objective was to proselytize, and they could not do that effectively if they confined their activities to the safety and seclusion of the forts and castles. Reverend Thomas Thompson, for instance, extended the castle school to Cape Coast Town and then to Anamabo and Tantum. Tantum is Otam, but they had a quarry there. Otam, that's the hometown of President Mills. They had a quarry there, so they named the place Tantum Quarry, whilst the actual name is Otam. And they had a school there from 1754 to 1756. In 1572, Catholic Augustinian missionaries started a school in Elmina Castle and later opened stations at Efustu, 8 miles north of Cape Coast, and Commander, 13 miles west of Cape Coast, Nana Ajiman's hometown. The Portuguese Catholic castle schools at Elmina and later at Fort St. Anthony in Axim, my hometown, started by 2 French missionaries, Fathers Colombin and Cyril of the Order of the Capuchins in 1638, suffered considerably from inconsistency and frequent interruptions. The longest period of continuous operation of the Elmina School was just 4 years, when it was operated from 1742 to 1746 by a Ghanaian Fanti Protestant chaplain called Eliza Johannes Kaptein. He was born in 1717 and died in 1747. Kaptein had been taken to Holland as a slave at the age of 9 by a Dutch trader, Van Gogh, not the artist. At the age of 9, and been educated up to university level at the University of Leiden. When he returned to the Gold Coast, he was put in charge of the Elmina Castle School. But he was hated by the whites because he was black. And the whites also thought that since they were white, they should have held the position that Kaptein was holding in the school. At the same time, Kaptein was hated by his own fantimen in Elmina because he supported slave trade. And he even gave a lecture in Latin extolling the virtues of slavery and slave trade, which annoyed his Fanti colleagues. Even though he is credited as being the first person to try and translate or to convert the Fanti language into writing, he wasn't a very happy man, and he died prematurely at the age of 30. After the Moravians had established a school in Christiansborg around the mid-18th century, the Swiss Basel people, the North German Bremen, and the Wesleyan Methodists followed. And they all faced considerable odds, the greatest being the high rate of mortality. 3 of the first 4 Basel missionaries who arrived at Christiansborg in 1828, Carl Ferdinand Saalbach and John Gottlieb Smith and Gottlieb Holwerth, all died within 3 weeks. Of the next 3 who arrived at Christiansborg in March 1832, only one, Andreas Ries, survived from a fever because he was prevailed upon by a local herbalist who recommended that he should take cold herbal baths 6 to 8 times a day. He fully recovered and moved to settle at KWAME in March 1835. F.L. Bartels says in his book that Ries's survival could also be attributed to the bracing mountain air of Ekropong and the stimulating local wine from palm tree, which provided him with vigor and proved to be very, very effective as a tonic. The Basel Mission intensified their educational effort from 1843 by opening a boys' school at Ekropong, followed by a girls' school in 1847, and a teacher training college for catechists and a seminary. And within 4 years of its establishment, the teacher training college had been able to attract and enroll 22 young men, no women, aged between 16 and 24. From Ekropong, they moved to the Abetifi Hills, my wife's hometown, to establish the Ramsey Center on the Kou Mountains. There too, they set up a school, a college, and the school and college became, and the people who attended the school became role models for the youth of the area in which the missionaries operated. And society measured the extent of sophistication in the society with the extent to which the youth had taken advantage of the mission schools and colleges. One aspect of the Basel Presbyterian schools was that the beneficiaries were separated from the general population. Pupils and students were kept in areas designated as salems and were generally not permitted to interact with the so-called pagans of the community. Indigenous cultures, such as drumming and wearing of traditional clothes, were strictly discouraged because there was a general belief that if the indigenes were allowed to mix their culture with the culture and the new religion, conversion rates would suffer. But historical records indicate that this rule was not that easily enforceable. And a number of the catechists and elders of the church, teachers and students of the elementary school and training colleges at Ekropon and Abetifi, used to sneak out of the Salems into town in the night to indulge in activities of their communities, including interaction with the females with predictable outcomes. Now, the youth of the time, who wanted to benefit from the new religion and education, but were equally anxious not to lose their ties with their roots, were often faced with difficult choices because the punishment for breaking the rules were very severe. The Methodists generally avoided this church-school dichotomy by penetrating the communities through the establishment of day schools. The Wesleyan Methodists, led by Reverend Joseph R. Dunwell, were very active in the then Western Province, now the Western and Central regions. They came to Cape Coast in 1835, and Reverend Dunwell's successor, Reverend Wrigley, established a girls' school in Cape Coast to teach the girls reading, writing, baking, and sewing, and groom them for marriage to the growing educated young men of the province. The school was called the Wesleyan Girls Primary School, and it was headed by a half-Fanti, half-Dutch woman, Elizabeth Waldron. Those who went to Wesley Girls High School, you are reminded of your houses, Wrigley, Waldron House, and all those. I haven't seen Bellamy yet. The secondary department, later on, around 1884, they established the secondary department, which became Wesley Girls High School, and it was run alongside the boarding school established in 1876, named originally as Wesleyan High School, and later Wesleyan Collegiate School, and finally its present name, Mfantsipim School. I understand there is a long-standing battle between Wesley Girls and Mfantsipim as to which one came first. Mfantsipim claimed that they were the first school. Yes, they were the first secondary school, but Wesley Girls started in 1836, first as an elementary school before they became a secondary school. Whether an elementary school qualifies to be a secondary school, I leave it to them to fight it over. Now, by 1844, the Methodist mission schools in many towns, there were many of them around the coast, in Accra, Winneba, Saltpond, and Mabo, and Cape Coast. The Methodists tried to go to Kumasi, but because of the wars, they couldn't survive. Their experiment there did not last long. By 1850, the Basel and Wesleyan Methodist missions provided the main educational drive in the Gold Coast, and the enrollment in their schools was over 1,000. And the pupils attending these schools paid for their own education. In fact, the Methodists, in one of their synod reports, said that the parents and the students were always prepared to pay for their fees. The Methodists also opened a training college at Aburi in 1922, which they transferred to 1924, which became Wesley College. The College at Aburi was later revived until the 1970s, when it was closed down again and its facilities transferred to the nearby Aburi Presbyterian Girls Secondary School. The Bremen missionaries worked mainly beyond the Volta in Peki, and they set up a school there in which they taught mainly in vernacular, the Ewe language. The Basels taught mainly in Chi and Ga. But the Methodists, initially, were teaching only in English until much, much later when they decided to mix their English with teaching in Fanti. Those who led the Fanti teaching in the Methodist schools were mainly the Fanti priests or the Ghanaian priests including Reverend Thomas Birch Freeman, Reverend Gadiola Akwa, Reverend F.C.F. Grant, Mr. J.A. Anobil, and Mr. S.K. Otu. They also set up farms, carpentry sheds for hands-on education. The missionary and educational efforts of the Roman Catholic Mission started relatively late. After their early experiment in Adzim, they couldn't cope with the climate, so they left. And it took another 30 years before the Catholics came in. But they worked so hard that within a very short time, the Catholics became the largest denomination in the country, and their schools, they had taken about 14% of the number of schools in the country. The Catholics introduced reforms in their education policies by introducing skills training as a means of impacting economic and social mobility of the youth in the areas that they were carrying out their missionary activities. By 1900, they had introduced boat building at Salpon, carpentry and printing at Cape Coast, and woodwork and carving at Elmina. This had a profound impact on the youth of these towns. Salpon and its nearby towns, such as Anumabo, Briwa, and Komansin, were all very active fishing communities, and therefore, boat building was a profession that would attract the youth of the areas and also be beneficial to the fishermen. The same applied to the carpentry and printing in Cape Coast, which was a growing metropolis, the capital town of the colony, and the center of educational development in the whole country. The Catholics followed the Methodists to the north, and they set up a school at Navrongo in 1907. Now, during the first 2 centuries of the colonial era, government involvement in education was virtually non-existent. Education in the Gold Coast was driven more by self-interest than by national development. Hence, by 1880-81, of the 139 schools in the colony, only 3 were colonial government schools in Cape Coast and Accra. The Basel missionaries had 47 schools, the Wesleyans had 48, the Brahmins had 4, and the Roman Catholics 1. The impact on the youth was therefore mainly religious. Socioeconomic development was secondary. Now, the Christian missionaries continued to dominate education and training of the youth throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. And by 1944, the Methodists managed 24% of education in the country, the Basel and Bremen missionaries 30%, the Catholics 14%, other Protestant churches, including the Zions, 10%, and the government only 22%, with most of them under the local government or native authorities. Now, even though the colonial overlords were the British, and the official religion of the colonial power was the Anglican Church, the Anglicans were relatively weak in the educational sector. They were nowhere to be found. They had started a school in 1752, which Philip Kweku tried to run from 1766. But with time, they were just not getting anywhere. And by the early 1900s, they had only 6 schools in the whole country. With time, the churches became increasingly dependent on government financial support because it was getting more and more difficult to get money from the congregants. Some of the churches, particularly the Catholics and the Methodists, felt that the situation that government was entering too much into their domain was going to affect the type of education policies that they should enforce in their mission schools. Now, what became of education under the colonial government? Notwithstanding the tremendous efforts of the missionaries, it became increasingly clear that leaving education solely in the hands of the missionaries, with very little colonial government intervention or control, would not fully meet government objectives and aspirations. Major reforms needed to be introduced to take policy issues from the churches and put these almost entirely in the hands of the colonial government. The beneficiaries of education, particularly the youth, needed to clearly understand where church issues ended and government control and direction began. A situation in which the colonial government bore most of the cost of running the schools, including teachers' salaries and provision of infrastructure for all schools, but the religious bodies controlled policies and authority over more than 75% of the schools at all levels, was not acceptable to the government. Something had to be done. The first real effort by government to take over almost fully the education sector took place in 1852 with the enactment of the very first education ordinance by Governor Stephen John Hill, 1851 to 1854. Governor Hill, those of us who are old enough will remember his name very well because he was famous for something he introduced called the poll tax. Just like the e-levy, it faced a lot of opposition. And he had wanted to use the poll tax to finance government projects. He was going to use that also for increasing the government involvement in education. But he wasn't going to include the churches, who had most of the schools under them. So the poll tax and Governor Hill's education ordinance proved very unpopular, and by 1874, no one could even remember it. It was not until 1882 that a new and more comprehensive ordinance was promulgated to cover the entire British West Africa. And the ordinance provided that the religious denominational schools would receive grants in aid according to their efficiency. The more efficient you were, the more money you got. This policy led to some of the mission schools actually closing down. There was a time when the Methodists had as many as 83 schools in the country, but as you will see later, the numbers began to dwindle because patronage at some of the places was very low, and they weren't getting enough government support. These are some of the provisions of the 1882 ordinance. That there will be a central board of education. There will be two types of primary school, government schools and assisted mission schools. Compulsory curriculum of writing, reading, arithmetic, English language, as well as needlework in the case of girls. They didn't say carpentry in case of boys. The stars of the schools were to be made up mainly of trained, certificated teachers. Buildings and equipment will be supplied by the government. But the Ordinance of 1882 also proved unworkable. It was heavily criticized by stakeholders in all the colonies. It made very little impact on the persons of school-going age, and it lasted for only 5 years before it was replaced by the 1887 Ordinance with appropriate changes. The two main changes were that the administration of the assisted schools was given to local managers instead of local school boards, and there was to be a central school board to formulate rules for the inspection of schools and the certification of teachers. The 1887 Ordinance was operated for almost 30 years, with a few minor adjustments in between, before it was replaced by the new policy reforms of 1925, which marked the beginning of the Gettysburg era of educational reforms. But the question one may ask, with hindsight, is whether the colonial government was really interested in the education and welfare of the youth of the Gold Coast, or the ordinance was merely meant to serve the economic interest of the colonizer. In spite of all the revenue that the colonial government was earning from economic activities in the colonies, the total educational budget for the Gold Coast, for example, was just 1.75% of the total government expenditure of £532,000. 1.5%. Based on the prevailing GDP, the percentage would even have been far lower. So, where did all the Gold Coast wealth go to? People sometimes say that the colonialists left us with plenty of money at independence. It's not true. While the colonial government had made some effort to educate the youth of the country, its commitment was very weak. For example, the total income from internal revenue plus export revenue for 1901 was £1,258,676, but the amount spent on education was just £6,513, £1,006,000, equivalent to 0.52% of total revenue. Similar figures for 1902. Revenue from internal generation and export, £1,285,748. Expenditure on education, £7,048. Compare this with the amount spent in 1902 on the instruments of enforcement of colonial rule, namely the police, £21,704. The army, £81,241. The prisons, £10,209. And customs and preventive services, £30,585. How then could the government have positively impacted the youth with such meager commitments to education? Indeed, the majority of those in the police and the army were uneducated or had the barest minimum of education, and none of them was in the officer rank. Currently, we spend between 30 to 40% of our annual budget on education, and even that is proving insufficient for the real cost of per capita expenditure on students. If really the colonial government of the time was interested in training the youth beyond just its short parochial interest of furthering the colonial agenda, it could have devoted far more of the country's resources to education. In effect, the Education Ordinance of 1882 and 1887 did not really bring much of an impact on the youth of the country. The envisaged increase in enrollment and upward mobility of the youth was minimal. By 1902, with Ashanti and the North now part of the Gold Coast, there were only 124 elementary schools. Government owned 7 of them, while it gave budgetary assistance totaling a meager $3,875 to 117 missionary-owned schools. This table shows you the number of schools in the country from 1895 to 1933. Oh, Mr. The one who is in, The Basel Mission, 1895, 33, 1898, 47, 1899, 60, 1900, 61, 1901, 61, 1902, 67. Methodist, 1895, 44, 1898, 54, 1899, 50, 1900, 55, 1901, 48, 1902, 43. They were decreasing. Catholics, 1895, 16, 1898, 11, 1899, 12, 1900, 12, 1901, 12, 1902, 10, Government, 767777. Bremen Mission, 000036. Islam, 001231. Zion, 000100. Total, 100, 118, 130, 138, 135, 124. So now we come to the Gaggisberg era. The 8-year governorship of Sir Gordon Gaggisberg saw perhaps the most significant and impactful educational reforms of the colonial era prior to the assumption of office of the first African government led by Dr. KWAME NKRUMAH in 1951. On becoming the governor of the Gold Coast in 1919, Gaggisberg decided that he was going to tackle education as one of his greatest priorities. And he considered various reports, including the Stokes report, committee report on which Dr. James E.K. Agri had served. As a result of the reports that he considered, he reviewed events in 1923 and then set up his education reform of 1925. He budgeted for £120,000, far from the £7,000 that was being budgeted for in previous times. And he decided that he was going to set up more secondary schools as well as a university. Now, Gaggisberg promulgated this Education Act of 1925, in which he published his famous 16 Principles of Education, which were as follows. Primary education must be thorough and be from bottom to the top. The provision of secondary education with an educational standard that will fit young men and women to enter a university. The provision of a university. Equal opportunities to those given to boys should be given to girls. Co-education is desirable during certain stages of education. Teaching staff must be of the highest possible quality and must be well paid to raise their status. They are still fighting over pay. Character training must take an important place in education. Religious teaching should form part of the school life. Organized games should form part of school life. The course in every school should include special references to health, welfare, and industries of the locality. A sufficient staff of efficient African inspectors of schools must be trained. Whilst an English education must be given, it must be based solidly on the vernacular. Now we are having problems with people being able to speak their own languages. There should be compulsory use of vernacular as the medium of instruction in the lower classes of the primary school. Now, this is one of the most intriguing recommendations by Gaggisberg. Education cannot be compulsory or free. Now we have free, compulsory, universal, basic education. Now, there should be cooperation between government and missionaries. Governments must have ultimate control of education, provision of trade schools, etc. Now, Gaggisberg was able to make some impact on the budget, that is the money devoted to education. But the increase in numbers that he expected did not materialize simply because he brought the reform in 1925. Unfortunately, his masters, the colonial government, felt that he was moving too fast for educating the locals, the natives, the people they call the natives. So by 1927, they felt that he was getting too big in his shoes, and they asked him to leave. But Gattisberg's program was implemented without commensurate provision of the requisite number of trained teachers. For example, enrollment in the 3 major teachers' colleges was very low, only 446. Presbyterian Teachers College had 196, Wesley College had 117, and Achimota had 134. So my father was one of the 117 people in Wesley College at that time. In effect, notwithstanding the effort he made, because he was asked to leave the country so quickly or so early, his dreams could not be realized. And the number of elementary and secondary schools from 25 to 27 was also inadequate to absorb all the young people. If you look at the slide, please, can I have yeah. You see that the total assisted secondary schools by 1925 was 210. By 1927, it was only 232. Government schools, 17, 17, 18. And by 1927, when he was leaving, the total number of assisted schools was only 250. The next table shows the various distributions. And you will see that now the Anglicans are featuring with only 6 and 7 schools. Now, even though Gattisberg tried, he was replaced by Governor Slater. But the 2 years he remained here had some impact on the youth. And the youth of the Gold Coast saw in him a champion for the realization of their dreams. And this is why, of all the Gold Coast governors from the 16th century to 1960, he is still arguably the one most often mentioned in very positive terms by Ghanaians, notwithstanding the so-called Gattisberg economy, which we have even not been able to change significantly up to now. Now, in 1937, there was an attempt to modify Gattisberg's education ordinance. And because there was a lot of protest in the country, people intensified their demand for education. So by 1937, after several deliberations, agitations against the colonial government, the government was obliged to appoint a committee whose report led to the establishment of the Central Advisory Committee on Education under the chairmanship of the Director of Education to advise. Until its abolition, this was the committee that advised government on all matters of education. A major outcome of Governor Gattisberg's reforms and the 1937 reforms was that by 1950, 41 of the 2,904 primary schools were directly run by the colonial government, while 1,551 received government grants. Total enrollment was about 29,640. For a population of 4.8 million, according to the 1948 census results, this came to about 5.7%. But it was still the highest in the whole of the colonial West African countries. By 1950, there were 57 secondary schools, of which 2 were government-owned, Achimota and Government Secondary Technical School, GSTS, Takoradi. 11 of the schools were established by churches, and they were government assisted, whereas 44 were said to be unassisted, and some were called government encouraged. 4 of the assisted secondary schools were for girls only. Out of 44, there were only 4. They were Wesley Girls High School, Aburi Girls Secondary School, Holy Child Secondary School, and St. Monica's Secondary School. St. Monica also had an elementary school and a teacher training college. After Gaggisberg, up to 1950, we come to the KWAME Nkrumah era, pre- and post-independence educational policies, 1951 to 1966. Although the two reforms of 1925 and 1937 brought about very significant changes in education, teacher education still lagged behind the other levels of education. Indeed, by 1950, there were only 19 pre-university training colleges offering a variety of teacher training certificate courses. There were only 2,529 qualified Certificate A teachers, 762 qualified Certificate B teachers, and as many as 5,000 unqualified or pupil teachers in the elementary school system. Now, even with the current number of 185,715 primary schools and JHS teachers, as at 2020, 67% of whom are trained, and over 70% of whom are female, we still do not have enough teachers to meet our requirements, and we lag behind several African countries with regard to the percentage of trained teachers. We need to look again at our teacher education and retention policies. Otherwise, we will continue to complain about falling standards, and our youth will be the worse for it. With only 57 secondary schools, most of them private, opportunities for secondary school education, as at 1950, were also woefully inadequate, considering the number of elementary school leavers who could have benefited from it. Technical and vocational institutions were in an even worse situation. So, in February 1951, the Gold Coast had its first general election, which brought Dr. Kwame Nkrumah to power as the first leader of the government business and later the first prime minister. Nkrumah had ambitious plans for the Gold Coast. His immediate objective was the fight for independence. But even before independence, he knew the country would require a substantial number of highly educated persons to run the country. He had gained power with his political party, the CPP, relying considerably on the youth of the country. But the youth had expectations, and one of the major expectations was to take the opportunity for social mobility through education. Nkrumah already had a clear philosophy of education, which he had honed while a student in the USA, through his meetings with his fellow Gold Coast student and close friend, Ebenezer Akwaje, and other West African students, mostly Nigerians. The group used to meet in Nkrumah's room at Houston Hall, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, USA. In the autobiography of Ebenezer Akwaje, entitled The African Dream, which is now in press, Akwaje discusses in detail what he and Nkrumah shared in common about education, not only for Ghana, but for the entire continent of Africa. I have had the privilege of reading the manuscript of the book and the honor to write a foreword. One of the cardinal philosophical principles of both Nkrumah and Akwaje was free education for all Ghanaians from kindergarten up to secondary school. I repeat, free education for all Ghanaians from kindergarten up to secondary school. Permit me to quote from the book. In the matter of education, it was the consensus of all the participants in the discussions in Nkrumah's room that in a democracy, it was a basic right of every citizen to be educated at the expense of the state. In particular, it was essential that primary and secondary education should be free and should be accessible to all persons. This should be so because education is the basis of national development in all aspects. Moreover, education is the key by which every citizen in every African country can open the door for his or her individual development in all spheres of life. It is education that will enable every citizen to be able to exercise his or her civil and political rights and obligations and make useful contribution to the development of the community. For these reasons, all African students held the view that it should be the duty of the state to finance fully a fee-free primary education and a fee-free secondary education in the African countries. Any person reading the book will observe that as students of Lincoln University, we thought about a system of fee-free primary education and a fee-free secondary education, not only for the Gold Coast, but something that was essential for all African countries. The discussions about which I am writing, that is Akwaje speaking, were held at Houston Hall, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, United States of America, by African students between 1937 and 1940. In effect, therefore, even before I was born, before President Professor John Evans Atta Mills was born, before President Jerry John Rawlings was born, before President Mahama was born, before President Akufo-Addo was born, before President Kufuor was born, when President Dr. Hillel Liman was only 3 years old, Kwame Nkrumah and his fellow African students, including Ebizini Akwaje, K.A.B. Jones Corte, after whom the lecture hall in Legon is named, K.O. Mbadiwe and his brother George, and Nwafo Orizu were seriously discussing free JHS and free SHS for the youth of Africa. One would therefore have expected that with Nkrumah now the leader of government business, prime minister of the country, he would immediately introduce measures to implement his dreams and educational philosophy to the letter. Akwaje was then not in parliament. He didn't contest the 51 elections. He contested as an independent and lost. And so could not be in Nkrumah's government. So what did Nkrumah do? Immediately after winning the elections, Nkrumah appointed Mr. Kojobo Otsio, a graduate of Fura Bay College, as the first African Minister of Education in the Gold Coast. Otsio immediately introduced the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan for Education in August 1951, which came into effect in January 1952. But Nkrumah adopted a gradual approach to the realization of his dreams for the country, and first introduced a fee-free primary education of only the first 6 years, followed by a 4-year middle school education for which fees were paid. He did not let free education cover the entire 10 years of elementary and 5 or 7 years of secondary education. Parents bought books and school uniforms for their children. The only part of the country where education was made absolutely free was in the then Northern Territories. The policy had an immediate impact on the youth of the country, especially the North, where education had lagged behind for a very long time. So, even this first education policy of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah recognized the need for some contribution by parents and recognized the need for a gradual approach, a pragmatic approach. The plan resulted in a massive expansion in basic education. NKRUMAH also realized that the measures in the 1951 reforms targeted only those of preschool and school-going age. But there was a large pool of young adults who had absolutely no education, but who were the people in key positions of the economy, such as farming, fishing, mining, trading, artisanship, drivers, the armed forces, the police, etc. We used to have two types of policemen. Escort police, those who wore the blue woolen pullover in hot Africa. And they wore some red cap. They were mostly uneducated. And we used to call them the Buga police. These people needed to be given some basic skills in reading and writing. So he converted the colonial government-supported but voluntarily organized People's Education Association into the mass education movement. Mass education was spread throughout the entire country into towns and villages, and teachers in the elementary schools offered free part-time education to the youth in the evenings, using the classroom facilities of the schools. The ability to read and write was first concentrated on the local languages and very basic numeracy. Before long, there was a significant pool of farmers, traders, artisans, and tradesmen, such as carpenters, drivers, and mechanics, who could read and write. Some even became Bible lesson readers in their various churches. Newspapers in the vernaculars. There was one in Fante called Nkwantebisa. There was one in Chi called Akwansusem. There was one in Ga called Mansralo. There was one in Efe called Motabiala. And there was one in Zima called Kachivule. They sprang up. And it was common to see both children and adults rushing to buy these newspapers to read about local and national issues in their local languages. Even secondary schools used these newspapers as resource material for their local language lessons. I dare ask, where are all those vernacular newspapers? They are all dead. No wonder we see all sorts of monstrous things written at the backs of trotro. Now, even though the 1951 reforms were generally hailed as most far-reaching since 1925, there was one aspect of it that proved to be very unpopular and received considerable backlash nationwide. Before the 1951 reforms, there was a terminal examination for school leavers called the Seventh Leaving Certificate, later to be called the Middle School Leaving Certificate, but popularly known nationwide as the Hall. Nana, I think you took the Hall. Secondary school entry was based on examinations conducted by individual secondary schools until 1949. Entrance examination was introduced for entry into secondary schools. One could take a common entrance examination in Standard 5 or Middle Form 2, Standard 6 or Middle Form 3, or Standard 7 or Middle Form 4. It was not compulsory. The only compulsory national examination was the Hall. But that examination was very stressful, and the failure rate, especially in the rural areas, was very high. Mr. Kojobo Otio, the Minister of Education, felt that the stress needed to be removed. He replaced the Middle School Leaving Certificate examination with a system in which determination of a person's readiness to leave the basic school was left almost entirely to the local head of the school. Every school conducted its own examination, an assessment based on weekly or monthly tests over the entire year. Then the head of the school would determine whether a student deserved an A, a B, a C, a D, or F. Subjects assessed were arithmetic, English, general knowledge, and the local language. The head of the school will then send the assessment to the regional director of education, who will send it to the headquarters in Accra for a so-called verification. Certificates will then be prepared with the name and school of the candidate and the assessment in the form of a table. People nicknamed the certificate with all sorts of derogatory names, such as fill in the blanks, Botio certificate, or toilet roll certificate. That one had two meanings. The certificates came in some form of rolls. So the headmaster will come and stand at parade, and they call your name, and then they tear yours and give to you. Not like the type that we were giving this time. They will tear yours for you, like you are tearing toilet paper. Its value as an end of education assessment compared to the middle school leaving certificate fell drastically. Employers did not respect it as a basis for determining the employability of a school leaver. Issues of students being shortchanged by subjective judgment by a teacher or head teacher for reasons other than academic were raised. Some people felt that some female students were being unduly bagged now for obvious reasons. If you were in the favor of the headmaster, you know what I'm trying to refer to. People also started questioning the comparability. How could one say that an A in arithmetic from a school at, say, Brahababoy, local authority middle school, be the same as an A from Cape Coast Government Boys School? Within the same school, I remember in my own school at Takwa, Methodist school students or pupils were challenging grades given to Anglican and Roman Catholic schools. Some people felt that Master Pencil was too hard compared to Master Muse or Master Ankwanda, Professor Ankwanda's father, at the Anglican school. He was replaced by Atu Ampier's father. So, within a matter of 3 years, the thing operated from 1952 to 1954, and NKRUMAH decided that the thing should be abolished. And we went back to the middle school leaving certificate, which operated for over 40 years until it was replaced by the JHS SSS. Can I have some water? What about higher education? What was NKRUMAH's philosophy about higher education? And what did he do? We have already looked at NKRUMAH's policy about primary and secondary education. At the time he and Akwaje were formulating their philosophy of education in the late 30s and early 40s, there was no university in the Gold Coast. Gagisberg's idea of a Gold Coast University had been rejected. But NKRUMAH had a very clear idea about higher education, which will surprise many of you. This is what Akwaje writes in his forthcoming autobiography, and again, I quote, "However, in the case of university education, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and myself," you realize that I didn't say Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and I, together with the other African students who were with us in America, agreed unanimously that students in African universities should pay for their university education, and that it should not be a duty of any African government to provide fee-free university education to every student. In other words, a citizen of any African country should not claim from the state or the government free university education as an inalienable right. However, in certain specialized fields of study, the pressing and urgent requirements for progressive development of the national economy of several African countries would make it essential and necessary that the state should award scholarships to all students who might be engaged in the study of the following specialized fields, namely agriculture, engineering, medicine, science, mathematics, and any other specialized field of study that the state would consider urgent or essential for national development within a specified time. So, NKRUMAH did not advocate for free university education. Now, after a long process of struggles, dating back to Blyden, Kisley-Hayford, Africanus Horton, and numerous committees, details of which I cannot go into now due to lack of time, but which will all be fully discussed in the final manuscript for publication. The first university in the Gold Coast was opened for classes on 11th October 1948, after being established in August 1948. We had the Asquith, Elliott, Bradley Committee, etc. Ghanaian cocoa farmers contributed 2 shillings and 6 pence per bag of cocoa, which yielded 897,000 pounds, with which the University College of the Gold Coast was established. When NKRUMAH assumed the headship of the country, the University College of the Gold Coast was only 3 years old. It started with only 92 students, 90 male and 2 female. And I'm happy to say one of the 2 females is still alive, Auntie Rachel Phillips. The other one, who is not with us, has a hall named after her at the University of Ghana. By January 1949, the population had grown to only 108. And by 1954, there were only 349 students, the lowest among the 8 universities that were assessed by the colonial government's Inter-University Council. By October 1951, Kumasi College of Technology was also established, which became KNUST. Now, even though NKRUMAH said there should be no free university, these universities had been established as free institutions, even with allowance for students. We used to get what we used to call 13 million. It was 13 pounds a term. But what NKRUMAH did was that he increased the allowance for science students from the 39 pounds per annum, or 13 pounds per term, to 99 pounds per annum, or 33 pounds per term. The medical students had theirs increased from 159 to 159 pounds per annum. But all the other students, the law students, the art students, the history, sociology, name it, they remained at 13 million. And you can imagine what we, the science students, did. These were meant to buy books, but the number of sound systems that appeared in people's rooms. I remember the sound system I bought. It was called Dansette Monarch. And you turn it on, everybody in your block hears what you are playing. That's what we use NKRUMAH's money for. Now, accommodation was a problem, not initially, but with time. By 1957, 3 halls of residence had been finished. Volta Hall, about 23 students moved from Achimota, first to Commonwealth Hall, and then eventually to Volta Hall. But when Volta Hall was being built, it was designed to carry only 100 people. And BAM said that the design was too ambitious and that with 100 occupancy, Volta Hall will take 10 to 20 years to have it filled with females. Girls went to Volta Hall in 1959. By 1962, there was pairing. And Saba Hall started in 1963 as co-educational. And Volta Hall Annex had been started. So this gives you an idea of what the colonialists thought about female education and what an indigenous African prime minister was able to do within a matter of just 8 years. Now, at 2020, the University of Ghana has about 60,000 students with almost 50-50 male to female ratio. As of 2020, the ratio is about 51.3 male to 48.7 female. In 1960, Botio passed the law that made the University College of the Gold Coast a full-fledged university in 1961. Then Cape Coast University followed. So by 1962, we had 3 universities. Then a year after the country became a republic, in 1961, the 1961 Education Act was also promulgated by NKRUMAH. That also increased the number of people that were able to enter secondary, elementary, as well as the universities. Another important reform that was instituted in '59 was a change of academic year from January to December to September, October to June. There were 3 main reasons for this. First of all, the long vacation falling in June to September would avoid especially elementary school children going to school during the heavy rainy season of June. Secondly, the start of the school year in January always coincided with a period where the farmers were in their lean season, and therefore they found it difficult to meet the cost of fees. Thirdly, starting the school year in October ensured that the school year commencement would coincide with just after the harvest period of August, when cocoa and other crop farmers would have received their benefits from their produce. The next reason was that the school year starting in January at a time when universities were starting in October meant that after the Cambridge School Certificate and Higher School Certificate examinations in December, students had to stay at home for almost a year until the following October before entering the university. The change of the school year to end in June meant that the school certificate and the higher school certificate examinations will now coincide in such a way that we took our exams in June and entered university the next October. This change was very, very good for the youth because it enabled their parents to be able to find the money to meet their educational requirements. What we now have today. Now we do not even know when the academic year starts and when it ends. Everything is in a state of flux. Students can be asked to travel long distance to school, only to be told on arrival to go back home because of technical and logistic reasons, all because of poor planning and lack of adequate finance. The current situation is certainly not the best for the youth of today. Many are confused about the future of their education. Teachers, students, and managers all confirm the fact, even if in whispers, that uncertainty is the order of the day. Another thing that NKRUMAH did was the setting up of the Ghana Education Trust Fund. We didn't have enough secondary schools. So he set up the Ghana Education Trust Fund to build schools. And within a matter of 4 years, he was able to construct 34 secondary schools. Prior to this, NKRUMAH had established the very first secondary school in the north, Tamale Government Secondary School, in 1951, to add to the 2 other government schools, Achimota and GSTS. The list on this slide shows the Ghana Education Trust schools. Unfortunately, they were not well distributed. There were 5 in the Western region, 5 in the Central region, 3 in Greater Accra, including Tema Secondary School, Accra Girls, and Adan Secondary School. 2 in Volta, Zogakove, and KJB. 8 in the Eastern region, 4 in Ashanti, 4 in Brunhafu, none in the Northern, and only 1, Navrogo Secondary School, in the North. In addition to these 34 schools, he also converted some of the existing so-called government-encouraged secondary schools into assisted secondary schools, and even built buildings for them with the Ghana Education Trust money. This is why when you go to a place like Labone, the architecture is almost exactly like Accra Girls. Labone was then a private school, but NKRUMAH took it up and turned it into a GET school. Now, Ghana National was another one, which was converted from an encouraged secondary school to an assisted school. Now, the establishment and the subsequent absorption of Ghana National is worth a special mention because of its political implication and subsequent impact on the youth. During the political riots of 1948, the colonial government expelled a large number of students and their teachers from various schools, especially in the Cape Coast Enclave. Mfantsipim and Augustins bore the brunt. After several unsuccessful attempts by NKRUMAH to get the UGCC party leaders to do something about this situation, he decided to set up a school from his own resources and with the support of a few philanthropists to absorb the dismissed students and teachers. This bold step by him was, however, turned against him by his colleagues in the UGCC and was cited as one of the charges of insubordination leveled against him, leading to his dismissal as the General Secretary of the party and his subsequent breakaway to form the CPP. The school originally went through a lot of problems as a private institution, but it soldiered on. But if NKRUMAH had not established that school to absorb all the young men and their teachers who had been expelled and subsequent students who attended that school, we would probably not have had persons such as our illustrious mathematician and former president of this academy, Professor Francis K.A. Alote, an alumnus of Ghana National. We would not have had His Excellency Mr. Kwesiama, a lawyer and an alumnus of Oxford, and a former Ghana High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and a Minister of Trade in NKRUMAH's government, and a member of the Council of State during the presidency of His Excellency John Agyekum Kufuor. We would not have had our current president of the Academy, Emeritus Professor Samuel Sefadede, an alumnus of Ghana National. We would not have had Mrs. Gladys Asma, a former Minister of Fisheries in President Kufuor's government. We would not have had Mr. Ernest Deborah, a former Chief of Staff. We would not have had Mr. Lee T. Okran, a former Minister of Education. They are all alumni of the schools. Above all, we would not have had Mr. J.J. Mensah Kane, the pioneer headmaster, who has become a legend among past headmasters of our secondary schools. Now, during the implementation of the 1961 Education Act, something also happened which also received a lot of flack from the general public. They decided to cut the 2 years form to 1 year, and the number of subjects taken from 3 or 4 to 2. So after 1 year's form, you could go to the university, and you needed only 1 A-level pass. So people rose up against it. Headmasters at that time had guts. They could talk without looking over their shoulders. So we had headmasters like Battels, succeeded by Abrokwa. We had headmasters like Charles Kwe. We had headmasters like Konwa of Accra Academy. We had headmasters like Father Glenn of St. Augustine's. We had Opokwa, we had the Prempeh College headmaster, what was his name? Osai, yes. They were all there. They all raised their voices. And within a matter of 1 term, NKRUMAH reversed the decision. And we went back to 2 years. At least he listened. In fact, even the director of education at that time, who was a professional, neutral public servant, and who had gone through the mill to reach the top, not a politician who was appointed because his party was in power, they all opposed it, that it was a retrogressive step, and it was changed. Now, if I may now go to the present. After NKRUMAH's overthrow, we had several other education reforms. But by the time he was overthrown, he had made a lot of changes. This table, which shows educational institutions in 1951 compared to those in 1966, show that in 1951, there were 1,083 primary schools. By 1966, there were 8,144. Middle schools, there were 639. By 1966, there were 2,277. Secondary school, government assisted, 13, and by 1966, we had 105. Technical schools, 51, we had 22. by 1966, we had 83. Teachers' colleges, 5 to 11, and universities, 1 to 3. Now, the reforms that took place after NKRUMAH, I wouldn't go into them in detail because of lack of time, but we had the Mills-Odoi Commission, the KWAME Committee report, Dr. Buzia's one-year education development, which was curtailed by the 1972 coup, in which he wanted to abolish the government subsidy to universities and replace it with loans, student loans. There was a case where, when he tried to enforce the student loan scheme, in one university, I wouldn't like to mention the university because there are former vice chancellors in this place. They went to where the Buzia, what do you call it, the student loan scheme forms were being filled. Seized power, collected all the forms, and set them up in fire, with fire, burnt all of them. And then Achampong came in 1972, made an announcement, student loan scheme abolished. The period 1979 to 2000 saw the reforms by Liman, Flight Lieutenant Rollins, which brought the FQ, the Ghana Vision 2020, etc. All these will be dealt with in the final paper. So I will now try and conclude my lecture by saying a bit about the free senior high school policy, which is the latest of all the education reforms. The latest of all the reforms I have touched on in this lecture is the free HSS policy of 2017. In principle, no Ghanaian will say that free education up to the secondary school level is a bad policy. The idea is not even new, as we've seen. It dates back to the 1930s and probably even earlier. Even though the concept is not new, it was a very bold decision by President Nana Akufo-Addo to introduce the policy at the time he did. But it is one thing taking a bold decision, and another thing putting together the program and modalities for implementation. If the policy maker rushes into the policy without a thorough examination of the ramifications, the outcome may turn out to be disastrous. I had the privilege in 2012 of having a one-on-one meeting with the president. At that time, he was a candidate, followed by a meeting with a team then working on the policy document. We discussed several issues which were unfortunately ignored in the implementation of the policy when it eventually saw the light of day in 2017. All the issues I raised are what are now bedeviling the entire program, and on the basis of which many well-meaning Ghanaians have been calling for a review of the program. These included the plans for financing the program, which I maintained would be unsustainable. I supported my arguments with facts and figures. I also mentioned the potential consequences of the expected large increase in enrollment if certain measures were not put in place to meet the expected inflow and outflow of young students and graduates. We also discussed the issue of potential stratification rather than equity if the cost of the program was not shared between government and the better endowed members of the Ghanaian society. Roland G. Sultana, Director of the Comparative Education Program in Euro-Mediterranean Studies and Head of the Department of Foundations in Education, University of Malta, once said, and I quote, Middle classes have a way of mobilizing themselves to benefit from free services offered by the state, rerouting in directions money from the public sector and the public coffers, even when it is meant to promote equity. Malta's university student stipend system is a perfect illustration of how such strategy can be exploited. What Sultana tried to say is that if you live in a society in which the gap between the higher and lower income is very wide, and you offer free education to everybody, irrespective of their ability to pay, it normally works to the disadvantage of the poor. And rather than achieve equity, you end up widening the gap between the rich and the poor. This is why some of us have advocated that we rather go the Latin American and Caribbean way, where those who can afford to pay for all or part of their education do so, proceeds from which can then be used to support those who really are needy. At least those who can afford it ought to pay for the feeding of their wards in boarding schools. Blanket free feeding of all children is more likely to result in malnutrition in a country where what is allotted for feeding an adolescent child a day cannot even give a 3-year-old child one balanced meal a day. We also have to bear in mind the potential effect of the expected large increase in enrollment. Increased enrollment as a result of greater access can result in lowering of standards. Therefore, if there is blanket provision of free education for everybody and there is a resultant increase in enrollment, there is the likelihood of population explosion, which, if not properly handled, can result in significant lowering of standards due to inadequate facilities, teachers, and poor teacher motivation and effective pedagogy. You see all these teachers on strike all the time. The tendency would be for those who can afford it to move out of the system and look for other avenues where they believe their children will get value for money, no matter how much it will cost them. Observers believe that this is already happening, with greater increases in the number of children who are opting out of the SHS system to take the International Baccalaureate, the Cambridge, and the London examination. There is a difference between the ideal and the pragmatic. NKRUMAH ideally preferred free education up to secondary, but he was pragmatic enough not to introduce it at the time that he was in power. What I keep asking myself is, what is so sacrosanct about the free SHS that makes our president consistently refuse to listen to public opinion and continues to stick adamantly to a policy that is obviously facing serious challenges and bringing hardships to its beneficiaries instead of the relief that the policy was supposed to bring? Conclusion. Let me conclude this lecture by humbly and passionately calling on His Excellency the President once again to listen to public opinion and have a second look at this policy, its implementation, and its repercussions on both the state and the individual. Even the finance minister, who is supposed to make the funds available for its implementation, initially questioned the rationale behind certain aspects of the policy. So far, I've not heard him give any reason for changing his mind, if indeed he has changed his mind. The policy can be fine-tuned to bring about a positive balance into its implementation? Why the constant refrain that free SHS will not be touched? With all due respect, review or re-examination is not the same as abolition. Mr. President, please listen to your people. They mean no harm. Even before we have finished grappling with the challenges, we now hear there is a new pilot scheme to be introduced that will bring about a 6-year SHS instead of the current 3 years. We don't know whether it's also going to be free for 6 years. I sincerely hope that this is not going to be foisted on us without comprehensive and open national discussion and scrutiny. We cannot afford to toy with the future of the youth with such frequent experimentation. I am done. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us give our speaker another round of applause. He anticipated the possibility of sitting down to deliver part of the lecture, and you saw his passion and resilience on this topic that he stood for almost 2 hours. Prof, thank you very much for this. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will not attempt to summarize this very detailed presentation. We look forward to the publication of the manuscript to guide all of us. But there is one thing he has said, which I believe the Academy, by the things we do and say for the public good, that as we look at reforms and introduce new things, listen to the population, listen to advice, and let's make sure that we don't foist anything that, with all the good intentions, may create a problem for the very people for which they are to serve. Professor Emeritus, thank you.
Thank you very much, our Chairman Emeritus Professor Sefadedi. A round of applause for him. The chemistry department of the University of Ghana would like to make a presentation to Emeritus Professor Adai Mensah. Chemistry department. Thank you very much, Chemistry Department. And we've come to the end of this evening's event, a very memorable one. I'd like to acknowledge the schools present here. They've done very well. Accra College of Education, Ganata SHS, Accra Wesley Girls, and Achimota School. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. This lecture is about the youth, and so it is appropriate that you are here to listen to it. As we leave here, there will be packed refreshment to be handed to us outside in the foyer. Let me end by thanking everyone here who has been able to join us for this evening's event, both here present and online. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Some of you have been here since Tuesday. We thank you all for being here. I'd like to also thank the families of the honorees who have been here since the beginning of this evening's proceedings. Thank you all very much. And to anyone else that I haven't mentioned, thank you. Now, may I please ask you to stand while the chair and the speaker leave the stage. Thank you very much.